Hello, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Merle Massey. I'm the coordinator for undergraduate research initiatives at the University of Saskatchewan, and this session is being recorded for SURE, Student Undergraduate Research Experience, and it will be posted to our YouTube site. Might be where you found this. Thank you so much for joining us today. Our session is on scientific writing, expressing difficult ideas clearly. And with us, we have the University of Saskatchewan Library graduate writing specialist, Jill McMillan. And Jill, over to you.
All right, thank you so much for inviting me to present on this topic, and thank you to everyone who has decided to join me this morning to look at how we can make use of our writing in order to communicate our ideas so that a greater number of readers can really understand what we're trying to communicate to them. So our agenda is as follows. First, we're going to very briefly consider the purpose and principles of scientific writing, and then we're going to really focus in on practical strategies that we can start applying immediately in our writing. So the strategies that we're going to look at how we can think of our topic sentences with more intentionality. We're going to look at how we can reduce subject length. We're going to look at how we can use concrete language, how we can create flow, and how we can also write more concisely. And then I have lots of recommended resources that I'll briefly highlight at the end that I would encourage you to explore at your leisure. So the purpose of scientific writing is pretty simple. It's sort of in line with a lot of what we think about when we think about effective writing. We want to ensure that our reader, our intended reader, understands what we are communicating to them, but also that they believe in what you are communicating as well. So when we're thinking about scientific writing, we're also thinking about writing where there is this larger academic context in which it resides, where we want to be as transparent as possible so that other researchers, if they're so inclined, can theoretically go and reproduce our results in order to determine the help to determine the validity of the work that we are putting out there into the world. In other words, I really like this quote: "Scientific writing remains an exercise in convincing another scientist of the validity of your work." So if you are writing for that scientific audience, it really is about sort of um, communicating with a peer. Whereas if you're interested in communicating with a larger audience, you can also make use of some of the different strategies that we're going to be looking at here today. So when we're thinking about our text, again, these are questions that suit contexts outside of scientific writing as well, but I think they're especially important whenever we are approaching a new writing task in the sciences. We can ask a series of questions. First, we begin with our reader. What knowledge do they already possess? What information will they need to know? So if it's someone who's in your immediate field, there might be some more shared knowledge. So some of the contextual information, that need for contextual information might be reduced. Whereas if you're writing for scientists outside of your field, you will need to supply more information. And then if you're writing for scientists who are far removed from your field, you'll have to provide even more context. And then certainly if you're writing for a more general audience, you're going to have to supply even more context. So there's a process of imagination here where you're really trying to envision who needs to engage with the text that you are producing. And so if we forget about the reader, then the rest of the text can sort of fall apart a little bit because we might not be pitching our text appropriately. Next, we want to consider purpose. Why is it important that other people have this knowledge that you are sharing with them? And what do you want them to do with it? I think often when we are producing writing, we think, okay, I have to produce this document, but sometimes we fail to ask ourselves why we are doing something. We just sort of fall into old habits. But taking a moment to think about why you're sharing this work in the first place, what you would like other people to do with it, that can help to clarify how you are going to present that information. You'll also want to consider genre conventions. So if there are certain conventional structures that you are expected to follow, for instance, if you are interested in submitting to a journal, the undergraduate research journal, for instance, you might make use of a more conventional structure, the introduction, method, results, and discussion. Whereas if you're writing in a different context, if you're writing a blog post, for instance, you would make use of very different structures. Next, you'll consider organization. So if you have these larger structures in place, well, how are you going to organize those smaller sections within the text? So are you going to approach things thematically, chronologically, a combination? So lots of different choices are available to you when writing. Next, you'll consider style. So what is the expected style or tone and how will you achieve this? This is all going to come down to how you are selecting your words and arranging them. So if you want to have a very formal tone, you're going to have um, more refined word choice, for instance. Whereas uh, if you want a more casual or conversational tone, you're going to use contractions and less formal diction. You'll also want to consider flow, so techniques that are going to help readers more easily transition from one idea to the next. And I think we tend to appreciate flow when there isn't flow in a text because suddenly we find ourselves having to do more work as a reader. We're not quite sure how one sentence connects to the other. If that's the case, that's an indication that the writer hasn't um, hasn't made the connection in those sentences as clear as they could have been, and that interrupts the flow of writing. So we want to consider how we can improve flow to make that reading more enjoyable for our readers. And then we also think of presentation. So how is that text going to be arranged? If you have a lot of data, how are you going to present that data? Are you going to make use of tables, figures, et cetera, et cetera? So just from that visual presentation, what is this text going to look like? And then we actually return back to that reader. How are we going to ensure that readers can easily read the final work? So this relates to notions of um, um, reducing barriers to understanding, focusing on expressing ideas a bit more plainly, a bit more simply. So why do we keep going back to the reader? Again, I'm going to share a quote that I really like. It does not matter how pleased an author might be to have converted all the right data into sentences and paragraphs. It matters only whether a large majority of the reading audience accurately perceives what the author had in mind. And so this really reinforces that you could have really fantastic results, really fantastic information that you have generated as part of your study. But if it isn't presented in a way that readers are going to want to engage with it, all that work will have a much lower impact because unless a reader is forced to read something, they might choose just to move on to another paper that has a similar focus. Increasingly, there are researchers who are looking at what papers get cited by other academics, and we see that there's actually a trend where papers that are written in a more accessible way tend to be cited the most because people with PhDs also prefer text that is easier to read. No one wants to spend a lot of time trying to decipher what someone has put together. So thinking about our reader can help ensure that we are producing a text that's going to be more accessible and perhaps even more successful because more people will understand what we're trying to communicate with them. So let's look at two examples of scientific writing in practice. And as we read through them, I want you to reflect and consider which of these two samples do you prefer and why. And you can just post that into the chat. So our first sample reads as follows. Remote sensing technology is widely used in river ice research in which safety concerns prevent the use of direct measurements. One remote sensing technology is RadarSat-2, a satellite used by researchers to obtain geospatial information. Using RadarSat-2, researchers can document the spring melt of lake ice, showing different breakup initiation dates. RadarSat-2 also helps them to determine ice thickening rates and to track differences in polarization backscatter, a process used to discriminate lake ice from open water. Sample 2. The utilization of remote sensing technology in river ice research, a field in which significant safety concerns play a role in the prevention of the use of direct measurements, has become widespread. Geospatial information can be obtained through the use of a satellite, which is known as RadarSat-2. The documentation of different initiation dates of ice on freshwater lakes during the melt of lake ice in spring can be achieved through the utilization of this important technology. The tracking of differences in polarization backscatter, which is a procedure that can be of assistance in the process of discriminating lake ice from open water, is another use of RadarSat-2. The determination of the rates of ice thickening can also be made through the use of RadarSat-2. So which do you prefer and why? Let's take a minute or two and contribute in the chat. Starting to see an emerging trend. There's a lot more preference so far for the first example. And some of the reasons that folks are noting is that it seems more straightforward, more concise. The messaging, it just seems more direct, arguably, in comparison to the second. And so if you have a preference for the first one, it's perhaps because you're valuing it has a clearer topic sentence, there are shorter subjects, it's somewhat less abstract, there's a stronger flow, and it's a bit more concise. Whereas arguably version 2, the topic sentence, that first sentence is a bit more convoluted, the subjects are much longer in part because of the passive sentence structure, it's more abstract, there's a weaker flow, and it's a bit more wordy. And this is where we're going to focus our attention for the rest of today's session, looking at how we can address these sort of concerns and apply these strategies to our own writing. So our tips to improve clarity include making use of effective topic sentences, improving sentence structures, reducing abstractions, creating flow. And we're going to consider both the old new information technique as well as parallelism. And we're also going to look briefly at some strategies for writing more concisely. So again, we're going to be looking at lots of different examples today. And here is our second example. So again, I would ask you to contribute in the chat which one you prefer and why. So let's look at the first sample. Over the past 2 decades, robust evidence demonstrating the significant impact of feral cats on Australian native mammals has emerged. Feral cats preferentially select small mammals as prey, and native mammal reintroduction programs have failed due to feral cat predation. Frank et al. Demonstrated that even low densities of feral cats have the ability to rapidly extirpate populations of reintroduced rodents in northern Australia. Sample 2. Feral cats preferentially select small mammals as prey, and native mammal reintroduction programs have failed due to feral cat predation. Frank et al. Demonstrate that even low densities of feral cats have the ability to rapidly extirpate populations of reintroduced rodents in northern Australia. Which do you prefer and why? Let's take a minute or two and contribute in the chat. Seeing a lot of emerging preference for our second example, and I'm going to be quite controversial. And I'm going to suggest that the first sample actually has a lot more strength as a piece of writing. And it's because of the first sentence. So if we actually look at both of these examples, that's the only difference. The first sample has a topic sentence, and the second example has that sentence removed. Everything else is exactly the same. It literally just deleted the topic sentence. So the reason why um, I think the first one might be a little bit stronger is because of that topic sentence. So if this piece of writing was introducing the topic, this sentence is going to provide a frame of reference for our readers so that they can anticipate and understand the paragraph content. And I know that in scientific writing and in a lot of writing, really, shorter is often seen as better. Um, we want to be concise, we want to be direct. but we still need to balance that with supplying appropriate context. So we can do this in a fairly concise way. We can do a lot in one sentence. So we can have a topic sentence like this that not only does it introduce the topic, it provides the research context, it provides a temporal context, and also provides a geographic context. So we might think, oh no, I need to have everything as short as possible, but you always have to balance that with your audience's needs. If your audience needs a little bit of context in order to appreciate what the rest of the paragraph is going to be about, then you really want to ensure that that topic sentence has a value, that it just doesn't immediately jump into more of the detail of the paragraph. So uh, I always like sharing this example because I always know that that the perspective might be a bit controversial, but I think it's sometimes we have to challenge what some of our previous instruction has centered on, which is often we want everything to be as concise and precise as possible, but sometimes we need a little bit of extra information. So keep that in mind as we continue. All right, so now we're going to look at more pieces of writing. Um, which do you prefer and why? I will also note there's no right or wrong answers. We are looking at preference. And the purpose of gauging what your preference is, that's going to help determine your style of writing. Because if you are drawn to certain styles more than others, if you think someone is writing more effectively than someone else, then what you can do is take what you like and apply that in your own writing and create your own style. So again, we're talking about preference. We're not talking about things that are right or wrong. Okay, so let's look at sample 1 and 2 here. So sample 1, the evolution of human behaviors through the adaptation of people to the new and changing conditions of hydrological systems due to climate change suggests that a continuous reassessment of water demand models is necessary. Okay, sample 2, as hydrological systems evolve in response to climate change, humans adapt to these new conditions. To monitor how changing human behavior impacts water systems, researchers need to continually reassess water demand models. Which do you prefer and why? Let's take a minute or two and contribute in the chat. We're starting to see a strong preference for that second. Um, but again, we're just looking at preference here. If you do prefer the second, it's likely because you're responding to the fact that we have far shorter subjects. And so it makes the relationship between the subject of the sentence and the action of the sentence much more clear. So we understand who and we understand the who and the what of a sentence much more readily. If we look at that first example, that the subject we really have to work through 2/3 of the sentence to figure out what the subject of the sentence is. Whereas in the second example, um, those subjects are much shorter and very closely connected to the verbs. So it's just making all of those relationships much easier to follow. And as noted in the chat as well, there's been another change. We've actually split the sentence into 2 sentences to make them, again, a little bit more easy to work through. There's perhaps a little bit of a tone difference, but if you want to ensure that your reader is going to understand um, your work more easily, then that second example has a lot of advantages. Don't be afraid of making things really clear and explicit to readers. I think sometimes we get caught up in this expectation where as academics we have to sound a certain way, we have to have this, this extreme formality. In reality, a lot of academics are going to gravitate toward writing that is stated more simply, more clearly, because the writing itself, it, it's it, it's all about enhancing the content of the ideas, rather than trying to obscure the information that you're trying to get out into the world. All right, so let's look at some more examples. So again, it's all about preference. Which of these do you prefer and why? The first example reads as follows. Here we demonstrate that much less expensive carbon sources can be used without purification to grow high quality monolayer graphene directly on the backside of copper foils under the H2R flow. Okay, our second example. Here we demonstrate that much less expensive carbon sources such as food, insects, and waste can be used without purification to grow high-quality monolayer graphene directly on the backside of copper foils under the H2R flow. For food, a Girl Scout cookie and chocolate were investigated. For waste with low or negative monetary value, we use bulk polystyrene plastic, a common solid waste, blades of grass, and dog feces. For insects, another often negative value carbon source, a cockroach leg was used. So which do you prefer and why? Let's take a minute or two and contribute in the chat. This is where we are a little bit more split in terms of some of those preferences, but we're seeing more people gravitating toward that second example. And I agree, it is a little bit shocking perhaps to encounter reference to dog feces in a piece of published scientific writing, but does it make the text memorable? And do you think the scientists were doing this for a reason? I think so. But if you're gravitating toward that second one, it might be because not only does it have more information, but it's supporting the information with very concrete examples. So, what might be a benefit of concrete language? Let's take a minute or two and contribute in the chat. Exactly. So it relates to this notion of what we can perceive. And the more concrete something is, the more likely we have some sort of point of reference. And so we can sort of make that connection to existing knowledge in our mind. And that connection can become stronger as a result of something that can be more easily imagined. It makes things far less ambiguous. It makes it much more clear to a lay audience, but can it also make it more clear to a more specialized audience? Arguably, yes. I mean, this was taken from American Chemical Society. So this text isn't being written for a lay audience, it's written for an audience of fellow scientists. But people do respond well to concrete imagery in writing. So, as noted, it can really help to improve reader comprehension because we're taking these sort of concepts and we're attaching them to things that can be more readily imagined. So, really making use of our ability to imagine. So, you know, a lot of us will have familiarity with Girl Scout cookies. A lot of us can imagine, if not all of us can imagine, what a blade of grass looks like. A lot of us have encountered a cockroach. I have not included a picture of the dog feces, but I'm sure when you say that word, a lot of you can imagine that immediately. And that's the power of concrete terminology. So when we're talking about concrete language, it's all about what can be sensed. So via sight, touch, sound, taste, smell. And that's in contrast to more abstract language. So if you're referencing, the concept of an idea, knowledge theory, or different qualities like dedication or courage, that's more conceptual. That's harder to envision. Whereas something that's concrete, we can attach that to our sort of lived experience as human beings. All right, so now into another example in terms of um, another opportunity for you to express your preference for one uh, example over the other. So our first example reads as follows. Among various strategies, biofortification is a balanced, economical, and sustainable approach to reduce nutritional deficiencies globally. Biofortification of pulse crops, including pea, is one of the major objectives of the breeding program at the Crop Development Center, University of Saskatchewan. Example 2. Among various strategies, biofortification is a balanced, economical, and sustainable approach to reduce nutritional deficiencies globally. One of the major objectives of the breeding program at the Crop Development Center, University of Saskatchewan, is the biofortification of pulse crops, including pea. Which do you prefer and why? Let's take a minute or two and contribute in the chat. Seeing a split preference here. Um, and I've encountered that before when sharing this example. And again, it's all about preference. And if you prefer the first one, it might be because you are responding to what's referred to as the old new information technique. Whereas if you prefer the second one, it might be that you're resisting the passive sentence that the first example has as its second sentence. So again, it's all about preference. So we will look at the old new information technique. One of the things to be mindful of with the old new information technique is that it can push sentence structures to be a bit more passive, which is something that sometimes we want to be very mindful of. So again, it's all about the choices that are available to you um, as a writer. So if you like certain things, apply them in your writing. If you don't like certain things, you have the choice not to apply them in your writing. So the old new information technique, if you're not familiar with this, is a simple way of structuring information where you take the old information from a previous sentence and you situate that at the beginning of your next sentence before the main verb. And then you include new information after that main verb. And what this does is a very simple way of establishing strong links between sentences, and this can help to generate some flow and is often quite an appealing structure within the English language. We're going to look at this in a little bit more detail. So we can think of the old new information technique as something that we can extend throughout many sentences. We can extend it throughout an entire paragraph. And we have flexibility to identify what is old with different vocabulary. If the reader has a good appreciation that that references the preceding sentence, then we can change some of that vocabulary. But what tends to be a bit more common is making use of some of that existing vocabulary. But again, we have these different choices where if you're worried about becoming too repetitive, you would look for alternate ways to express that old information at the beginning of the new of the next sentence. Whereas if you're less concerned about repetition, you could just reuse some of those keywords over and over and over again in order to strengthen the connection between the sentences. So here, we'll just read through part of it. So antibiotic resistant microorganisms have significantly compromised antibiotic treatment. A large proportion of resistance in gram-negative bacteria can be attributed to resistance gene cassettes contained within a site-specific recombination system termed the integron. So highlighted in yellow in that second sentence is the old information. So here we're referencing antibiotic resistance as a large proportion of resistance. And so that's sort of echoing back to that previous sentence. And then it continues as we continue reading. So mobile cassettes, that's referencing back to these gene cassettes in the previous sentence, contain genes that confer resistance to nearly every major class of antibiotic and some disinfectants. And so in blue, this is where we're introducing new information. New gene cassettes, that's helping. This is an instance where we're really relying on our audience's prior knowledge to be able to understand that these new gene cassettes are referring to that highlighted blue information. Um, but then we continue on and on again. So new gene cassettes continue to be identified, and sequences of over 60 cassettes are deposited into the GenBack EMBL databases as of January 2001. And then this rapid increase in the identification of gene cassettes, that's referencing back to continue to be identified and in that previous sentence. So we can incorporate this technique very strategically as we write in order to connect sentences very, very strongly. And often the more strongly sentences are connected, it can create that sense of flow. Now, another way in which we can make use of this technique, and this is a way in which probably a lot of you, if not all of you, are already making use of it, perhaps unintentionally, is substituting um, reference to the previous sentence with the phrasing of this or these. Because you can use this or these plus a noun to easily reference back to what has been stated in a previous sentence. So our example here, Skypes and Wilson found that short bursts of intense exercise showed more benefits than longer but less intense workouts. This finding, that's referencing all of the underlying information in the previous sentence, is consistent with those of other researchers. So you can use that as a way to continue that old new technique in order to help establish some flow in your work, make those connections between the sentences as strong as possible. All right. Another strategy that we can make use of to help maintain flow is that of parallelism. And parallelism is all about just helping to organize information for readers. And in science writing, often you're going to have complex lists that you're presented, that you might be presenting in extended prose. And so making sure that this information is presented in a parallel way is going to help keep things organized for your readers, and it's not going to pull them out of that reading process. Because what happens if you encounter a sentence that is not following a parallel structure, readers might get distracted. And that's the issue with faulty parallelism. Because parallelism, it's all about creating this very pleasing predictability so that readers become very much immersed in the content rather than being distracted by structural considerations. So here we have an example from a journal called Ecological Applications. It reads as follows. 3 broad ecological groups have been described, including epigeic species, which live and feed exclusively in the litter layer, endogenic species, which live and feed in the mineral soil horizon, and endectic species, which burrow deeply but feed primarily on fresh surface litter. Just for context, we're speaking about different worms. This is all about worms, the exotic European earthworm invasion in North America. Okay, content aside, this is such a fantastic example of how you can make use of parallel structures when presenting information in a list. And it's a combination of the structure, but also some of the word choice that's helping to prime readers to anticipate what the structure is going to look like in this piece of writing, which is just one sentence in length. So we have 3 broad ecological groups being referenced. So this is sort of that grouping noun, that sort of dominant noun. And we are now primed to anticipate reference to groups. And that anticipation is fulfilled with the first reference to species, and then it's reinforced with repeated references to species. And so we know that, oh, okay, my expectation is being fulfilled. And that is pleasing to me as a reader because I'm not having to make connections for myself. I'm having to do less work as a reader because the writer has already done the work for me. The structure continues to be arranged in a parallel manner. We have those function words which appears after each reference to the species, is introducing a relative clause, which then contains a verb or two verbs in each example, as well as some supplementary information in terms of geography. So we have this nice pattern of live and feed, live and feed, and that becomes a little bit disrupted in our final example, burrow and feed. And this is probably arranged quite intentionally because the writer knew, okay, once this pattern breaks, then it would be awkward to return to that same sort of pattern of live and feed, live and feed. So it's really just playing into readers' expectations. And then again, we have just that little bit of supplementary information in terms of where all these different actions are taking place. So the litter layer, the mineral soil horizon, and surface litter. So really good example of parallel structures in action. All right, so let's look at yet another example. They never end. But again, it's all about trying to determine what you are responding to as a reader and how you can start applying that in your own writing. All right, let's look at our first sample here. Scientists recently utilized computer models to highlight how certain angiosperms become dominant in frequency when mammalian herbivores are preferentially excluded from gaining access to forest habitats. Okay, example two. Scientists recently used computer programs to show how some plant species become common when rabbits and deer are prevented from accessing forests. Which do you prefer and why? Let's contribute for a minute or two in the chat. Always a really fun example because there are I think, very strong opinions here. So we have a lot of preference for one, but then we have a couple of people cheerleading for the second one. There's a lot of reference to, oh, it's very dependent on the audience. And this really is an example of the sort of tension I think that exists between in terms of tone and style, because that first example, I think it reads more as what we encounter in academia, but ultimately the information is the same. Let's break it down a little bit. So, utilized just means used. Highlight just means show. Angiosperms are simply plant species, dominant in frequency, common, mammalian herbivores. Herbivores. We're speaking about rabbits and deer in this context. Preferentially excluded, preventing, gaining access, accessing, forest habitats, forests. And so some of you have made this distinction. Well, one is more suitable for an academic audience, one is more suitable for a lay audience. And I'm not disagreeing. Obviously, if you're pitching for a more general audience, the second one is the way to go. But I think we should also ask ourselves, well, why can't we use some of what we see in that second example for a scientific and an academic audience? What's the harm? Is it because we're worried that our work won't be taken as seriously? Because if our reader is going to be able to get the same information more easily from that second example, um, why don't we use that approach instead? And I shared this little quote. This is from an article, The Top 10 Reasons Why Manuscripts Are Not Accepted for Publication, published in Respiratory Care. Some authors apparently believe that they must impress the reader with their erudition and mastery of multisyllabic words in order for their work to be given the appreciation it deserves. This is a mistaken notion. With scientific writing, the simplest and most direct statement of the intended message is always best. And again, I recognize that our writing is very much informed by all of the feedback and all of the advice that we've received up until this moment in time. But sometimes it's worth sitting back and evaluating what we have been taught or what we've encountered, or I think more importantly, what we have assumed about writing, and think about whether or not we want to explore other ways of expressing ourselves in our written communication. So one strategy that we might want to consider is how we can reduce and simplify words in order to be more concise, more direct with our writing. So here we just have a table that highlights some really common pieces of sort of academic style of writing and how we could actually substitute those words or phrases with more direct language. So instead of a considerable amount or number of, we can just state instead many, much, many, numerous. Likewise, based on, in view of, due to, owing to, the fact that. It can become because, as, since, due, for the purpose of, in order to, usually just for or to. I would suggest that 90% of the time or more, in order to can always be eliminated. It can always just be replaced with to. That in order is almost redundant all of the time. Has the ability, capacity to, can, has the potential to, could, in regards to, regarding, pertaining, in connection, on, about. Is interesting to note that, interestingly, taking into account, considering, there's no doubt that, undoubtedly, no doubt, utilize, employ, use. Utilize is one of the words that I'm always encouraging writers to change, because use means the exact same, and it's less, it's just more direct. So don't be afraid of using some of those more simple terms. Let's look at another example. Which you prefer and why? Exposure to test compounds for several days is commonly used to determine if they cause an inhibition of cell proliferation. Sample 2. Cells are often exposed to test compounds for several days to determine if the compounds inhibit cell proliferation. Which do you prefer and why? Let's contribute in the chat for a minute. Emerging for that second example. And if you have a preference for the second, it's because you are resisting zombie nouns, which are present in our first example. So zombie nouns are these sort of dead nouns that can actually be turned into verbs. They might have originally existed as verbs, but they've been turned into nouns because of the flexibility of the English language. So we can make sentences much more direct and active if we take that subject, and we can identify it and place it at the beginning of the sentence, and also take those zombified nouns and turn them into nice verbs instead. So exposure can become exposed, inhibition can become inhibit. So as noted, if the verb is available to us, we want it's often preferential to gravitate toward the verb rather than the noun. So some of the common zombie nouns include effect, analysis, applicability, contribution, decision, provision, reduction. These are very common in academic writing, but strong verbs actually exist that we could use instead. And the issue with zombie nouns is that they require supplementary information to make them fit into a sentence. So we have to add prepositions or additional verbs for these zombie nouns to function um, in a grammatical way. And so by removing the zombie nouns, turning those zombie nouns into verbs, we can reduce the wordiness in our text. I also just want to make a quick note on active and passive sentences. I referred to this a little bit earlier in relation to the old new information technique. If you're not familiar with active and passive, simply an active sentence, the subject is very clearly the doer of action, whereas in a passive sentence, the subject receives the action. So here we have an example. The active version, the experiment shows inconclusive results. Passive, inconclusive results were the findings of the experiment. Now, in discussions around scientific writing, often there is a preference for passive sentence structure. And this reflects certain ideas around the objectivity of scientific writing, which is something that we could discuss for hours, because often it's more of a perception of objectivity rather than any actual objectivity. But what's really interesting is when you look at advice from leading scientific journals, there's often a very strong preference for active sentences. So if you're familiar with Nature, for instance, one of the most famous academic journals just anywhere, there's a preference for the active voice. Likewise, different groups like the National Academy of Sciences, they might have a preference for the active over the passive. Science, again, another huge journal, there's also a preference for the active voice when it suits the context. So I won't say that one is better or worse than the other because passive sentences do have value. If you're instructed to phrase something as a passive sentence, you can do it, though you do have the freedom to ask why it should be phrased in a passive way as opposed to an active way. But it can help to communicate that sense of objectivity. You know, dogs were used to produce insulin in the early 1920s, so we're not like making value judgments, and we're not making reference to who was actually um, who was actually helping to um, make those dogs into sort of the experimental subjects in this instance. If we don't have an actual or obvious subject, then the passive sentence is also very valuable. So the laboratory was vandalized. If we don't know, then the passive makes sense for that context. And it's also something that we can make use of in our general writing toolbox to create some sentence variety. So you can mix up active and passive sentences to help engage readers. But if you have the option and it makes sense, often choosing the active sentence over the passive will tend to be more desirable for readers. So we have a few minutes left. I just want to comment a little bit on revision and identify some resources that might be of value to you. Revision, it's all about polishing up your prose, and a sort of checklist that you could add to whatever revision process you currently use is to ask yourself some of the following questions. When you're looking at your subjects in your sentences, you can ask, are they too long? If that's the case, you might want to shorten them, make those relationships between, you know, the who and what in your sentence much more obvious. Is there a lot of abstraction in your writing? Can the ideas be made more concrete? Should you add definitions or include examples, for instance? Are things flowing? If not, should you use the old new information technique in certain contexts? Or could you organize information in a more parallel way? What about wordiness? Are you encountering unnecessary words or phrases? Can you reduce them or eliminate them altogether? And what about nominalization? Are you encountering some of those zombie nouns? Can they be replaced with nice, strong verbs instead? Because revision is a huge part of the writing process. And again, just to share another quote, when I write a scientific paper, I complete a final draft and then shorten it by as much as a third. So if you're getting a little bit frustrated with the piece of writing that you've produced, just keep in mind that the vast majority of texts that you are encountering in your own research and reading, those are the result of multiple drafts. People have had other people look at them and give them feedback. They have gone through and changed it multiple times before they have had it accepted for publication. So when you're comparing your work to the work of others in your field, keep that in mind. Your paper can also become as strong if you also go through that revision process in the same way that they have. So in terms of some resources and takeaways, I won't go through all of these in detail, but I've highlighted some of my favorite scientific writing resources that you are free to explore at your leisure. And I've just included notes as to some of the information that is contained within those resources, sort of a mini annotated bibliography, if you will. Um, and just in terms of those final takeaways, I think it's so important to just keep track of who you like to read in your field. If you find that there are some authors who just seem to express themselves in a way that you find really understandable, study how they are communicating their research with the world, how they are communicating with other academics and scholars. what rhetorical strategies are they using? What makes the writing clear, accessible, or compelling? Because they're just using different writing strategies. It's not that um, they were just born as this amazing writer. They're making very deliberate use of different strategies. And you too can make strategies to improve clarity. So you can make use of the old new information technique. You can use shorter subjects. You can make use of concrete nouns. You can make use of parallel structures. Because when we're writing, we're always learning something new and we're always developing as writers as well. But thank you so much for joining me and inviting me to speak on the topic of scientific writing. If you're looking for supports or services around math, sorry, this should read study skills, not grad skills, research support, writing help, all of those services and more are available at the library. And I'm also happy to stick around and chat if there are any questions.
That was just fantastic. Thank you so much. I learn every time I listen to you speak, and I try and apply it to my own writing. I'm going to stop the recording, but please send in your questions on the chat.